Hi, our group decided to do the Cantwell versus Connecticut 1940 case. I'm Allie, this is Jose and Justin.
For this presentation, we will be discussing a landmark Supreme Court case that helped shape the understanding of religious freedom that we enjoy today in the United States. Cantwell versus Connecticut was decided in 1940, and this case focuses on the First Amendment's Free Exercise Clause, which protects every individual's right to practice, share, and express their religion without interference from the government. What makes Cantwell versus Connecticut so significant is that it's tested how far those protections go, especially when someone's religious message offends others or comes into conflict with state laws. It really set the foundation for how courts balance freedom of religious with public order. In this case, the petitioners were Newton Cantwell and his two sons, Jesse and Russell Cantwell. The Cantwells were Jehovah Witnesses, a Christian group known for their door-to-door ministry and strong commitment to spreading their faith. They truly believe that preaching from house to house and sharing religious materials was a sacred duty commanded by God, and not something that should ever be restricted by government approval. On the other hand, the respondent was the state of Connecticut, which defended its law that required individuals to obtain a state permit before they could solicit donations for religious or charitable purposes. Essentially, the state argued that the law was meant to protect citizens from fraud or harassment, while the Cantwells argued it unfairly restricted their ability to freely exercise their religion. Some basic facts. In 1938, the Newton Cantwell and his sons went door to door in a prominently Catholic neighborhood in New Haven, Connecticut, as part of their ministry. They carried religious pamphlets and portable phonograph to play records, which sharply criticized Catholic Church and organized religion in general. After playing the record, they will ask people if they'd like to make a small donation to support their religious work. However, Connecticut law requires anyone soliciting donations for religious or charitable causes to first obtain a state approved permit. Local officials could decide whether a cause was truly religious before granting it, which the Cantwells saw as an improper government intrusion into matters of faith. The Cantwells chose not to get that permit because they believed it violated their principles and their religious freedom.
With all that being said, the Cantwells continued to preach door to door. After some time, some residents became offended by their preaching, not by just the message, but the recordings that criticized things like the Catholic Church and such. And in turn, people started complaining to the police to the point where the Cantwells were arrested and charged with two offenses, those being soliciting donations without a permit and inciting a breach of the peace, meaning that their actions supposedly provoked anger or could disturb public order. They were found guilty in the local court, but the Cantwells refused to give up. They appealed their conviction, arguing that both the law and their arrest violated the First Amendment's guarantee of free exercise of religion. They believe that no state should have the power to decide which religions are legitimate or require permission to share one's faith. They made their case go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the justices were asked to decide whether Connecticut's law was constitutional under the First Amendment. This became one of the earliest and most important cases to define what religious freedom truly means in America, setting the precedent that the Free Exercise Clause protects individuals from state laws that unfairly burden their religious practices. Now for some of the legal issues. In this case, the Supreme Court had many things to wrestle with, many constitutional questions such as religious liberty and free speech. The key issue was whether Connecticut's law requiring a government approved permit before someone could solicit religious causes violated the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. The justices had to consider whether the government can legally require people to obtain a license before they share their religious beliefs or ask for religious donations. If the state can control who is allowed to evangelize, does that give government officials too much power over religious expression, which clearly goes against what the First Amendment says? Another major question is how far can the state go in regulating speech to maintain public order? Can the government restrict certain forms of religious expression simply because they might upset or offend people, or would doing so violate protections guaranteed by the First and 14th Amendment? The court also had to think about the balance between protecting citizens from harassment and protecting the constitutional right to evangelize. Where is the fine line between maintaining peace and infringing on someone's ability to spread their faith? Finally, the justices had to examine whether religious solicitation should be viewed as religious exercise and free speech, meaning it receives dual protection under the Constitution. These questions form the core of the legal debate that the court needed to resolve in this issue of the Cantwells versus Connecticut.
So now talking about the perspective on the court's decision, as a group, we agree with the Supreme Court's ruling in the Cantwell versus Connecticut. To us, the decision really gets to the heart of what religious freedom actually means. No one should have to get government approval just to talk about their faith or ask for religious donations. That defeats the whole purpose of the First Amendment. Yes, the Cantwell's message upset some people, but being offended isn't the same thing as being in danger. They didn't threaten anyone or intimidate anyone, and they weren't violent. They were simply sharing their beliefs. In a free country, emotional discomfort can be treated like a crime, can't be treated like a crime. We also appreciated how strongly the courts emphasized that the government can't pick and choose which religions are acceptable. Connecticut's permit system basically handed power to state officials to decide which messages they liked and which they didn't. Striking that down protected everyone, especially minority or unpopular religious groups. And honestly, one of the biggest reasons we support this ruling is its long-term impact. By applying the free exercise clause to this states through the 14th Amendment, the court made sure these protections aren't just federal, that they're nationwide. It is guaranteed that people in every state have the same right to practice and share their beliefs without fear of government interference. Overall, we support the court's ruling because it protects religious liberty and reminds us that peaceful evangelism is still fully protected by the Constitution. Now, to bring our presentation to a close, Cantwell versus Connecticut is one of those cases that might look simple on the surface, but it is actually changed the entire direction of how religious freedom is protected in the United States. The core issue of the Supreme Court addressed was whether a state could require people to get government approval before they shared their religious beliefs or asked for donations for a religious cause. In this case, Cantwell family was going door to door sharing their messages. And even though some people didn't like what they heard, the Cantwells weren't threatening anyone or causing physical harm. They were just practicing their faith. The court ruled that Connecticut's permit requirement violated the free exercise clause. And what makes this case historic is that it was the first time the Supreme Court applied the free exercise clause to the states through the 14th Amendment. Before Cantwell, most First Amendment protections were only applied at the federal law level. After Cantwell, states were also held at the same constitutional standard. Another major point the court made is that while states do have the power to regulate things like time, place, and manner for safety or order, they cannot create licensing systems that allow officials to pick and choose which religious messages are acceptable. Giving the government that kind of discretion opens the door to censorship, discrimination, and unfair treatment, which completely goes against the purpose of the First Amendment. This ruling has had a lasting impact. It strengthened both religious freedom and free speech by making sure that individuals, even those with beliefs that might be unpopular or different than the majority, are protected. In a diverse society, those protections are essential. If the government can silence one group because their message is unpopular, then it technically could silence any group. So the main takeaway from Cantwell versus Connecticut is that protecting minority or controversial religious views is actually a crucial part of protecting liberty for everyone. The Cantwell case really became a foundation for many of the religious freedom decisions that come later, and it still influences how courts think about free exercise rights today. All in all, that is the end of our presentation, and thank you for watching.